This morning, hearing about all the challenges and difficulty of long-term monitoring of seabirds, and then in the second session we heard that in fact seabird biologists have it easy compared to marine biologists who are trying to study what's going on beneath the waves. The theme this afternoon is to, if you like, go back to the first theme of this morning, which is to talk about the challenges and the diverse methods for monitoring seabird populations. And to kick off our session, this session we have Rob Thomas from the University of Cardiff, who's a lecturer here who's been studying storm petrels, probably the most challenging of all seabirds, for about the last 20 years.
Okay, thanks very much, Dan. So it's been an interesting debate as to who has the most difficult to measure study species. Over lunch I did a quick tour of the tea room, and although the warden I interviewed wanted to remain anonymous, he says counting stormies just like counting trees, but they're invisible, nocturnal, underground, and most of the time they aren't there anymore. So what are these stormies, European storm petrels? Well, as you probably know, they are tiny seabirds. In fact, they're the smallest of the Atlantic seabirds. There is a least storm petrel, which breeds in the Pacific, which is a little bit smaller, but less migratory and therefore less interesting. They're highly oceanic, so they are spending most of their lives out at sea. Quite how far out at sea is one of the things that we're just starting to learn. And they are long-distance migrants, as I say. The European storm petrel isn't necessarily European for a lot of its life, and each year they're doing this amazing trip halfway around the world to spend the non-breeding season partly or largely in the productive upwelling regions of South Africa and Namibia, and some of them are rounding the Cape into the Indian Ocean. So for a tiny bird, these are about the size and weight of a house sparrow, 25-26 grams. These are amazing travellers and amazing survivors because, as with many juvenile seabirds, they have very long lifespans. Storm petrels regularly found living to 20 years or more. There are quite a few storm petrels over 30 years, and there are just one or two storm petrels like me over 40 years. So, of course, we'll be thinking about the Welsh Islands in this talk, but it's just to emphasise that as global travellers, these aren't necessarily Welsh birds or British birds or European storm petrels. They're also African birds, and we need to understand the threats facing them in that global international context, taking into account the threats that stack up on them across the annual cycle. So as well as data from the Welsh Islands, I've been involved for many years now in a study run by a Russian bird observatory in southern Portugal, where the storm petrels are migrating past the Portuguese coast en route back to the breeding colonies. And through collaboration with Mark Bolton, who studies storm petrels in lots of places, but especially in Musa on Shetland, I'll introduce a little bit of data from Shetland as well. So, as we say, storm petrels are remarkably, perhaps, difficult to survey, but they are surveyable. And one way to survey them is to catch them, and to do that, you play the song of the storm petrel on a large loudspeaker, if need be, and the birds hear this, and they believe it's a real storm petrel. They come to investigate, and this is the chance to, of course, catch them in a mist net. So the storm petrel's call is famously the sound of a fairy being sick, and if you're not familiar with fairies being sick, it's the chick, I think, is the hurling out of the vomit. Very loud. Okay, so we can use this technique to catch storm petrels, but we can also use tape playbacks to evaluate the responsiveness, the presence or absence of storm petrels in their nesting burrows, because not only are they invisible, of course, they're also underground, so it's impossible to walk up to them and count them directly. We can elicit a response through tape playbacks. And then in the next talk, Matt Wood is going to talk about some of the really fantastic novel methods that are becoming available now for surveying storm petrels in the darkness. So ringing studies allow populations to be monitored in a range of ways, including mark recapture type population estimates. Ring studies also allow survival estimates to be calculated, and of course with these rings being read by ringers elsewhere around the breeding range or along the migration route, then migration behaviour can itself be investigated. And as a long-distance traveller, we need to be understanding the impacts of climate change, for example, on the bird's migration, just as much as we are understanding the impacts of climate on the bird's breeding biology. So with the tape playback survey methods on both of the Welsh Islands, this has been done over the years. So one of the most recent playback surveys on Skomer suggested a population of about 100 pairs, but these are estimates based on rates of reply to tape playbacks. Not every bird replies. The reply rate differs between islands and between years and between day and night, and there's a lot of correction factors that are applied to produce these population estimates, and the confidence intervals around those estimates can be quite wide. So with two different methods, there's either about 100 or about 60 storm petrels on Skomer, or there was in 2009 in a whole island survey. On Skokholm, the population is a lot bigger for various reasons, and again, tape playbacks have been used to estimate at least the population size of storm petrels on Skokholm. From the 1960s, there were estimates of somewhere around 6,000, and this seems to be the start of a decline across subsequent decades, and it seems likely that there's probably around 1,000 pairs there now. But rather than whole island estimates on Skokholm, with the establishment of the new bird observatory, this offers the fantastic opportunity really through repeated annual monitoring of study plots to sample a subsection of the overall population, but hopefully to get a much finer scale resolution of population changes on the island. I'll also just mention some data that I've been involved with collecting, using storm petrels as sensitive bioindicators of climate-driven changes in the marine ecosystem. And because storm petrels are so tiny, and in that sense so vulnerable to environmental change and so responsive, they are perhaps a wonderful case study in investigating how very small birds are sometimes very strongly influenced by how the climate affects the state of the ocean, the living seas. So here's a result from the long-term study that goes on in Portugal each year. This was begun in 1990. I pitched up in 93, and I've been trying to get back there every year since. It's an ongoing study. And this is one of the key results, looking at the body mass of these European storm petrels migrating past Portugal, but they're heading north in early summer en route from Africa, south of the Sahara, heading back to the breeding colonies. And these include plenty of British ringed storm petrels, so they are very much our birds in that sense. And as you can see, the average body weight of a storm petrel is quite small. It's 25, 26 grams on average across the whole period. But you can see that there are these major fluctuations in the body mass of the birds year on year during these migration journeys. And this represents about 10 or 12% variation across the years in the bird's overall body mass. That variation in body mass is at least largely comprised of changes in the bird's stored fat reserves. The fuel, if you like, that powers the bird's migration and acts also as a buffer against starvation during lean foraging periods in the harsh and sometimes quite unpredictable environment of the open ocean. So these changes represent very large, substantial alterations in the bird's migration fueling strategy, if you like, during their active migration en route back to the breeding colonies in early summer. So we've been investigating then what might drive this oscillation, this changing level of fuel reserves. And you can see here that there's a very nice relationship between the body mass. This is now expressed as relative to the mean body mass across the whole period. So 0 here would represent 25.5 grams. So if it's positive, the birds are heavier than normal, and negative, they're skinnier than normal. And birds tend to be skinnier when the sea is relatively warm and carry more fuel when the sea is relatively cold. That doesn't seem to be a direct thermal response to feeling chilly, so putting on an extra overcoat of fat, you could see it as. It doesn't seem to be that, because there's a very strong time lag in this relationship, and it's actually sea surface temperatures in April that are most strongly correlated with storm petrel fat reserves when we're monitoring them on their early summer migration in May and June. Actually, sea surface temperatures in May and June are not significantly correlated with body mass at all. It's a very lagged time effect. So it suggests that it's not a direct thermal effect. It suggests that there is another link in that causal mechanism. And the obvious candidate for that is via the effect of climate, sea temperature, so a manifestation of climate variability on the bird's food supply. So the obvious next step is to look at storm petrel food supplies and see how they're varying. But a big problem with doing that is the lack of information, really, about what storm petrels really eat, and especially what they're eating on their migration journeys, as well as around the breeding colonies. We can use proxies of food supplies. This is net primary productivity, so the amount of chlorophyll, basically, in the sea. And you can see that there's a negative relationship there between productivity and body mass. In other words, it's maybe a slightly counterintuitive relationship that we're seeing there. Migrating petrels are heavier in years when their food is scarce, at this end of the graph, than when their food is relatively abundant. Food as measured by the overall productivity of the ocean. But storm petrels almost certainly don't eat primary productivity. They eat animals that eat the productivity in terms of phytoplankton. And this is where Renata Medeiros came in as my PhD student here at Cardiff. Renata's in the audience, give us a wave, Renata. And her PhD project was partly focused on identifying the diet of storm petrels using the new molecular DNA-based approaches that are now coming through. And here at Cardiff, we're all obsessed with poo of various animals, and bird poo has been a particularly productive strand of research for storm petrel diet, because it's possible, or it's possible for Renata to, I've never done this in my life, but apparently one can isolate the DNA of the prey from the feces of the storm petrels, basically by screening out all of the bird DNA that is also in there. And then by amplifying up the DNA, we can first of all test for the presence or absence of different overall categories of prey, like fish or invertebrates. And then either by cloning and sequencing through bacteria, or by the new next generation technique of pyrosequencing. These are two different ways, essentially, of reading the genes that are in that soup of prey DNA that's being extracted from the bird poo. So what you end up with, especially with pyrosequencing, are lots and lots of DNA sequences. You don't know what they are yet, but fortunately online there are massive gene databases that you can match the sequences that you've found with and get a very educated guess, if you like, at what that prey has been in the bird's diet. So Renata basically spent several years getting this to work with storm petrels, but it works very well with not just storm petrels, but a range of seabirds and many other animals beyond, of course. And this allows us to get species-level descriptions of diet and foraging behaviour, very useful in understanding these causal mechanisms influencing body mass changes on the migration route, but it's likely to be just as useful and interesting on the Welsh Islands of understanding the foraging needs of the birds during the breeding season. So what do we find? Well, when storm petrels are passing Portugal, as you might hope, they eat a lot of sardines, as do I when I'm passing Portugal. They also eat a couple of mackerel species, but they're also eating quite a lot of fish products, if you like, from deep water species that are only really accessible to these surface foraging or shallow diving species by being trawled up from the depths and available to the birds, probably as fisheries discards. So they do seem to be, at least on migration, partly relying on fishery discards. They're also eating lots of other things, including various species of marine isopods, and by looking at the behavioural ecology of the isopods, you can actually learn quite a lot of interesting facts about the behavioural ecology of foraging storm petrels, including foraging inshore at night. This research has also highlighted some degree of variation in diet between years in these migrating birds. And so we can examine different parts of this climate, ecosystem, bird food web, if you like, and using statistics you can start to tease apart the different patterns here. I won't try and explain these graphs, they are just examples of patterns that we can identify, for example, between the abundance of sardines and the level of body reserves that storm petrels are carrying on their migration. You'll have to ask Renata exactly how much fun you can have statistically teasing apart these patterns, but that's part of an ongoing project. But what this does is allow us to build up these ecological networks, if you like, investigating how climate-driven changes in the environment, as can be measured, for example, by sea surface temperatures or this North Atlantic oscillation, ocean basin scale oscillation in climate processes, how these feed through then to important aspects of the environment like net primary productivity, and how primary productivity itself drives a food web of creatures reliant on that productivity. By identifying through this DNA-based approach parts of the diet that are particularly important to storm petrels at particular times of year, like sardines as storm petrels are migrating past Portugal, we can identify not just the nature of those relationships, but also sometimes the direction of these effects. So although there's a negative relationship between primary productivity and storm petrel body reserves, there's a positive relationship between sardine abundance and body reserves. In other words, it might not be entirely strategic buffering against starvation that we're seeing between years, but if we're focused on sardines, that looks more like direct food limitation going on. So it's just to explain that this is a kind of complex system that we're investigating with an ongoing project, but these are the kinds of clues about the complexity of the birds' lives and how that complexity is impacted on by the shifting climate and sea conditions. Further north around the breeding colonies, and this is data from Musa Broch from Mark Bolton at the RSPB, we can see direct food limitation going on. So here is breeding productivity. This is essentially the probability of a storm petrel pair producing a chick in each year, plotted against the primary productivity in Shetland waters this time in each year. And when the sea is productive, storm petrels tend to produce significantly more chicks. So that's a nice example of direct food limitation that we can identify. So that's a little kind of snapshot, I guess, of storm petrel research based at Cardiff, but using the time and expertise of lots of other people around the world, really. In terms of future prospects, the establishment of Rich and Giselle on Skokom as the wardens at the new bird observatory there, or re-established bird observatory, we should call it, allows the re-establishment of annual population monitoring of storm petrels as well as all the other birds. Because Skokom, as home to Ronald Lockley and then Derek Scott, and storm petrel enthusiasts in subsequent decades, Skokom has really fantastic long-term opportunities to investigate how storm petrels and their breeding biology in the past have differed from the breeding biology in the present day. So there's between decades comparisons of breeding biology that are ready and waiting to be made, and potentially feeding in diet analysis to understand in more detail the mechanisms of these kinds of climate impacts on breeding biology, as well as the migration ecology of these long-distance travellers. Thanks.
Any questions? Right.
The four key species, prey species that you showed us there, they're not exactly small fish. So one makes the assumption that we're looking at males, prey. Have you done any work to look at how the bird's migration patterns, timing matches with known reproduction and
So the presence of DNA just tells you so much, and then you've got to do some interpretation there, of course. That DNA could be from eggs or very small fry or great big adult fish. If you look at the regurgitators of storm petrels that you conveniently provide if you catch them from time to time, you can see that there are semi-digested lumps of reasonably large fish. But that's not to say that eggs and very small fish aren't also important. We've also found storm petrels that had seemingly eaten a dolphin. So it goes to show that could be dolphin poo, it could be foraging on a carcass, it could be picking up bits of oil, all sorts of things.
No, I was just wondering, in terms of reproductive areas, spawning ground, nursery ground, whether it's that they just happen to like those four species, or it just happens that those four species happen to be reproducing or whatever at that time of year.
The coastal belt of Portugal, and Renata's becoming a sardine biologist by accident here, is a very productive sardine spawning ground and hatchery, and the birds are seemingly skimming the coast. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah, so and the storm petrels do pass by during just after May spawning period for sardine. But interestingly, sardine has been reducing tremendously, and other species seem to be actually taking over. But what we saw is that sardines does seem to be the prey that consistently is seen over the years. So they don't seem to be switching. It seems that they do rely on other prey as well, but sardine does seem to remain the source.
Can I just ask, how far do stormies forage from Skomer and Skokholm? Any idea?
Well, I don't think it's very well known, because storm petrels are too small really to have taken on any of the kind of tracking technology that we've been hearing about in other contexts. That's kind of beginning to change, but only now, I guess. There's been radio tracking and a tiny amount of geolocating.
Yeah.
So I guess we'll learn rather more about that in due course, but they're across the Irish Sea, aren't they? And it's,
Any correlation at all between the weight of birds that you catch in Portugal and the breeding success when they then arrive on breeding grounds in Wales? Or have you not caught
well, it's more that it's not really been feasible to ask that question yet, because of the lack of detailed temporal resolution in breeding data from the UK. But again, I really think that the establishment of the Skomer Observatory with detailed annual monitoring of storms is a real opportunity to make that kind of link. But again, it's another real need for long-term data sets to be established and maintained.
Allied to that, one more thing. Any movement to put artificial nests or sites on to make it easier for you to monitor the birds there?
Yeah, and in fact there are nest boxes on Skomer and Skokholm. The uptake of them is rather poor, so it doesn't happen very often. I'm not going back there, but now and again storm petrels are prepared to breed in basically plant pots with children attached. And again, it does suddenly make more research questions accessible, but the numbers currently in S boxes are very small.
Okay, thanks very much.